So far during my YouTubing days, I've had a lot of opinions, ranging from all the way to being a spy main. It's pretty much in the job description that I've flooded the community with salty and angry opinions, but today I'm clocking out, and I'm gonna make a video about something a little different. Today I'm talking about a weapon that has almost a completely neutral view in the community's eyes. The Cloak and Dagger seems like it should be a lot more discussed, being only one of 3 of Spy's watches, one of the most integral parts of the entire class. I think the reason it's not talked about all too much is that it's an extremely safe weapon discourse-wise. No one thinks it's broken in any way, overpowered or underpowered. I like to think of it as the Chicken McNugget of Spy's arsenal. Sure, it's no bag of fries, it doesn't compare to the McChicken or the McDouble, and it's nowhere near my beloved McBitchin'. Yeah, do a fucking McDonald's analogy, that'll work great. The point is that the Cloak and Dagger is pretty much the opposite of a contentious weapon. One might think that because of that, there wouldn't be a lot to talk about, but I think the opposite. Because of how rare discourse around this watch is, I don't think many people talk about, or more importantly learn about what makes this thing unique, as well as how to actually know which situations favor its use, or vice versa. As with any weapon, we'll start with some base stats and comparisons. The rate at which Cloak is lost with the CND is based on how fast you're moving, so we'll start with the timings assuming you're constantly running. While running, the Cloak and Dagger always has 2/3 the amount of cloak time that the default Inviswatch has, regardless of what weapons you have equipped. By default, the stock lasts 10 seconds, while the CND lasts 6.6. With the YER equipped, the stock is 7.5 seconds, Cloak and Dagger is 5, and so on and so forth, with the other combinations listed here. The more interesting part of the cloak times for the Cloak and Dagger come with the other movement speeds, as one could assume. Backpedaling is an ever so slightly form of movement compared to moving forward or strafing, so you can technically get more distance with this watch by walking backwards, although that's pretty impractical. What's slightly more practical, however, is crouching. If you have a full cloak meter and start moving while crouched, your cloak will last just barely under a whole minute before needing to recharge. According to the wiki, this allows you to move 3.3 times the distance you normally could by walking, albeit at a third of your typical movement speed of course. While it often isn't practical to crouch all the way around the map due to your slow speed, in a tense situation where you need to move but don't have much cloak, a bit of crouch walking can save you with your more efficient cloak loss to movement ratio. Aside from these stats, there are a few other things to keep in mind with how the Cloak and Dagger operates that can be important to know when using it, so here's a bit of a lightning round. Unlike the stock watch, you can't pick up ammo while cloaked to regen your meter, so you need to decloak to do so, and even when you do, you get 35% less cloak from them compared to stock. When you run out of cloak, instead of decloaking immediately, your silhouette is revealed to the enemy until you stop moving it and regen some meter. This can actually trip you up sometimes if you're used to the DR or stock watch, so make sure you realize when you're out of cloak to avoid getting caught in a silly way. Third, your cloak meter regens naturally at twice the rate of the default watch, taking 15 seconds to recharge fully as opposed to 30. And finally, a bit of a weird one, but increasing your movement speed with items like the disciplinary action or a kill with a big earner actually doesn't increase your cloak drain rate while invisible despite you moving faster. Alright, so all the stats about the Cloak and Dagger listed so far are very important, but most of them don't warrant too much discussion outside of just being aware of them. Know how different movement speeds can affect your cloak, be careful when grabbing ammo, and get used to the faster drain and regen speeds. All important things, but also pretty simple. What isn't nearly as simple, however, is the definitive stat of the Cloak and Dagger, the ability to stay invisible for an indefinite amount of time so long as you stand still. It's as simple as it sounds. When you're cloaked and are on the ground and standing still, you will regen cloak instead of losing it. To start with a simple use of this ability, you are able to act as a bit of a camera for your team, in that you're able to view all enemy activities without any threat to yourself, letting your team know if the enemy has Uber, where their sentries are placed, or torturing your enemies with subliminal messages. This playstyle is often reserved for more competitive styles of play where spy is less consistent and relaying information is much more important, but it's still good to know about even in pubs sometimes. The more well-known and common use of the Cloak and Dagger in pubs, however, is the general ability to wait for the perfect time to strike. The default Inviswatch may have more cloak in total, but unless if you're near a dispenser, you will always be losing meter while using it. Even if ammo packs are nearby, your cloak is not guaranteed to last forever, meaning there's a consistent sense of urgency to make your play sooner rather than later. This introduces several risks. Running out of cloak of course, bumping into enemies while trying to grab ammo, getting impatient and making a sloppy play too early, and so on and so forth. What the Cloak and Dagger does is remove all those troubles and enable you to focus solely on 2 things: what the enemy is doing and deciding when to decloak based on that information. As I've mentioned before, this is what makes the Cloak and Dagger a great learning tool. Getting used to enemy habits, positioning, and basing your decloaks and approaches around those things is a huge part of playing consistently well as Spy. If your approaches are consistently sloppy, you will rarely ever get a kill, but if your approaches are consistently very safe and effective, the opposite will happen. Even though I've already made a whole video on this topic, I once again want to drive home how important a good approach is, and how this watch does such a good job of enabling said good approaches. In terms of what actually makes a good approach, I'm going to show myself here and recommend the aforementioned video I made about the whole topic. The discussion goes way beyond just the Cloak and Dagger anyway, so it wouldn't be fitting to talk about it here in a video focused just on the single watch. But that doesn't mean that's all there is to say about this watch, far from it. Knowing that the Cloak and Dagger does a lot to help you choose when you approach, as well as teaching you how to approach, is all well and good. However, this is where I find the discussion around this weapon often ends. But the Cloak and Dagger is a weapon like almost any other, with upsides and downsides, situations it's great in, and some that it's terrible in. So then it's time to ask the important question: what actually makes for a good time to use the Cloak and Dagger? Well, let's answer that question with a very simple principle. Objectively, the Cloak and Dagger decreases your ability to be mobile while invisible, and generally increases your ability to be stationary while invisible. This means that you can apply this rule. The more you'll think you'll need to move around while cloaked, the less likely the Cloak and Dagger is the right choice. But of course, this rule is a bit vague also, so let's get a bit more specific to figure things out. It can seem a bit generalistic to say that certain situations will always favor moving less or more just at a glance, but there are some very simple game states that favor one or the other. Most notably, game mode and being on offense or defense. Let's start with the simple example of payload. In a typical match of payload, you'll have the blue team pushing a cart along a path with a series of choke points, which leads to the goal of a capture point. Meanwhile, the red team's goal is to generally slow down the blue team along said path, but ultimately make their stand at any control points to make sure they don't get captured, be it the first or the last point on the map. Because of the natural roles that offense and defense puts players into, the blue team is often on the move and shifting their team forward, while the red team is encouraged to plant their roots and play area denial. Now, here's where the Cloak and Dagger finally comes in. When you're playing defense, the Cloak and Dagger is often a better choice because the blue team tends to move towards you, meaning you need to walk less yourself. Obviously, you can't remain stationary, you'll still have to move around a bit to get to the enemy, but the lower movement ability and higher stationary ability the C&D gives you generally favors the defensive position a lot. This especially applies to the start of the round, where you're able to wait out things like blue's Ubers and initial flurries of damage before striking. Meanwhile, when playing on offense, you generally face more threats like sniper sightlines, sentries, or enemies parked in certain areas, meaning you'll need to walk around while invisible far more, favoring the stock invis watch. The important exception on offense, of course, is when there's a really heavily guarded sentry nest or something in the area and you need the ability to wait for the perfect time to strike, as anything less results in you dying, but we'll talk about this situation more in a bit. Anywho, I use payload as an example first because it's both popular and has easy to understand roles of offense and defense, but the logic does carry over to pretty much any other game mode. Attack defend often follows similar logic, King of the Hill has you either attacking or defending based on who has the point, and 5CP has you swapping between attacking or defending at the same time, so you can swap your watch accordingly based on what your personal goals in the game are. Capture the Flag is a clusterfuck as always, where if you're playing Spy, your only goal is to attack extremely well defended intel rooms, which means the Cloak and Dagger is almost always the right watch to use, unless if you're just playing to be aggressive. Alright, two more things. First off, this is the part of the video where I put a big fat asterisk that says, none of this is black and white. The rules that I've set up I think are relatively consistent and can help you when choosing whether or not to use the Cloak and Dagger, but they are by absolutely no means guaranteed. These rules are a great base to use as a starting point for integrating the Cloak and Dagger into your own playstyle, but ultimately everyone is different. There are a lot of situations in which both watches will probably be fine, in fact, maybe a majority of situations are that way. And it's really important to consider whether if you're playing more offensive or defensive just on your own. If your playstyle typically tends to be much more aggressive, then the Invis Watch will probably serve you better overall. But if you tend to play more smart and defensive and really try to make all your approaches great, then the Cloak and Dagger might favor you. Everything depends on your playstyles. But regardless, here's durrbill's definitive "which watch do I use" guide. The left of the bar represents when you're playing on more defensive situations, the middle and righter areas represent when you're on more offensive situations, and the rightmost area is when facing an extremely tight defense when playing offense, think something like upward last. The more red the area is, the more the situation favors the Cloak and Dagger, while the blue means Invis Watch. And finally, below I'll list a few edge cases and exceptions, along with another disclaimer that this is not definitive. Sometimes the Invis Watch is a fantastic choice on defense, and sometimes you really need the CND on offense. Be open and flexible, but feel free to use this guide to help you figure things out if you're a bit confused or new to Spy. It's a yellow watch, dude. How did I talk about this thing for 12 minutes? This was supposed to be a shorter video.